I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Susy Cheston is the Senior Advisor for Financial Inclusion 2020, the Center for Financial Inclusion at ACCION. She previously served as Senior Director for Water, Sanitation and Hygiene, Agriculture and Economic Development for World Vision. In that position, she oversaw a team providing technical assistance, program management, and new business development for WASH, Agriculture, Economic Development, Shelter, and Climate Change. She's well qualified to moderate this session, and I'll hand it over to Susy. But first, I'd like to also hopefully welcome people who are watching us live online. So the event is also being live streamed and will be available afterward on our website or on YouTube. So thank you, everybody, and over to Susy.
Thank you, Sabina. And you mentioned that these reports are being sold. I didn't hear the price.
The report is being sold for $7.95 at the bookstore. I don't know if there's tax on that or not. But it's also, I should say,
It's to get a bag with it.
It's also, every little bit of the report is available online at www.stateofthecampaign.org. We put everything up on the website, and Larry will be showing you that as well.
Thank you. So I'm really surprised it's only $7.95. Once you have a chance to review it, you'll be amazed as well. I am delighted to be here for a really significant event. The Microcredit Summit campaign over many years has been galvanizing the microfinance community and always has something important to say in its State of the Campaign reports that not only reflects on the history and the trends of the past year, but also helps us look forward. And I'm therefore very pleased to bring this group together. For our session today, we have Alexia Latortue, who's the Deputy Director of CGAP, the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor. And Alexia is also a very important voice in running the Clients at the Center initiative at CGAP and has become a very important thought leader in the industry in restoring us all to a client-centric focus. She brings tremendous experience. The time she spent in Paris leading CGAP's efforts there was a rough gig. But she's also spent time in West Africa and Haiti and done a lot of interesting things. Perhaps the thing I'm most jealous of is that she speaks English, French, Creole, and German. I don't even want to talk to you. I am also really delighted that Wendy Apt is with us as the Deputy Assistant Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. And Wendy is focused on economic growth, education, and environment. And she brings a marvelous background for looking at financial inclusion. Deep experience in Africa, a lot of experience in banking, looking at international investment in Africa in particular, and a variety of other areas that are really directly some of the issues that we in microfinance and financial inclusion are addressing today. So it's wonderful to have you. What's to say about David? David is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, and I'm always surprised when I look at his bio and remember that he doesn't just work on microfinance. He has a few other things he looks at as well. I don't know when he finds the time for that. Debt relief and aid effectiveness among them. David's probably best known now within the community globally for his book Due Diligence, and for the really exciting and interesting way he engaged people in that process of writing the book through his open book blog. Perhaps a slide might be helpful just to show a little bit more about David. These are my daughters in the front, celebrating my daughter Jill's 12th birthday, and you see David in his sword dancing costume. Just to show that different worlds can come together, there's proof that the microfinance, financial inclusion world can come together with the sword dancing community. I have to say, at the Christmas Revels, which is a wonderful show, David and his group Sword Dancing was absolutely the highlight. So I highly commend this to you. Okay, let us, since we're talking about vulnerability, the State of the Microcredit Summit campaign report, let's hear a few highlights from it. Larry, what do you have for us in terms of some of the big takeaways that we should remember?
All right, a few new things to report to you this year. One of the new things is we put our report on the web so that you can read it there. As Sabina said, it's at stateofthecampaign.org. And so all of the interviews we've done as a part of this report, the numbers we collected, they're all available at this site on the web. And I'll give you a quick overview here of what's new this year. Hopefully it'll... All right. Well, it's not.
It's thinking.
The big news in this report, and you'll see the slide in just a little bit, is that for the first year since the State of the Campaign Microcredit Summit campaign started recording numbers, since 1997, when we started recording how many of the world's poorest had received loans, microcredit loans, the numbers this year went down. They went down by 10 million in the total number of clients served worldwide, and they went down by 13 million in the total number of the poorest being served. And so that's some of the highlights from this, and hopefully at some time you'll actually be able to see the slides that go with this. In our look at this, we found that the biggest contributor to the number of clients going down was, of course, India, where the Andhra Pradesh crisis in India, which was a case of several microfinance organizations in the same state in India lending to the same clients, causing overlending, causing a government response, a state government response that cracked down on lending, that caused many of them to stop lending in that state. The result now is 14 million fewer clients in India, but we also saw a slowdown in Bangladesh, where the number of clients there went down by 800,000. And in the other parts of the world, we saw growth that was not as fast as before, so the growth in the other regions of the world did not make up for the losses in India and Bangladesh. And here we go. And so the one region of the world where we did see significant growth was Africa, which increased by 1.4 million. But the fact is that the Asia region of the world comprises 80% of all microfinance clients. And so because of that, significant drops in Asia are not made up for in other parts of the world, and so worldwide the numbers went down.
Thank you, Larry, for that very brief overview, your model for us all. And I have to say, I realize I didn't introduce you. For one thing, it's your gig, it's your event, so I think that's sort of fair, but also I just kind of think of you as someone who needs no introduction. But for those who haven't followed Larry's career for many years, he is not only director of the Microcredit Summit campaign now, but I knew him best when he spent over 20 years at Opportunity International, including CEO of the Opportunity International Network and including significant time spent in the field in Zimbabwe, creating opportunities, Africa region. And in that time, in your career, you've always been focused on a triple bottom line. You've been focused on trying to reach to the very poorest. You've been trying to do that in a holistic way that's transformational. And you've been trying to do that in a way that looks at scale and sustainability as well. And so it's exciting to me in this relatively new role for you that you're continuing that work. So moving on, Alexia, you heard Larry's quick highlights of the report. You read the report in a soft embargoed copy. Were those your same takeaways? Did you have some other observations?
Under pressure to be brief now, but maybe a quick comment on Larry's highlight first, if I may. So I appreciate you being careful to stress the difference across geographies, because Asia can dwarf so much of our thinking, and because so much of it was due to India, not only India, and that was such a specific case in a particular part of India. I think it really is important to parse the data geography by geography to understand what's going on. So I just wanted to underscore that. I think my biggest headline in reading the report, and when you buy your copies, page 20, run straight to page 20, there is a discussion on the psychology of scarcity. And I think that's really, perhaps for me, the moment in the report that made me pause the most. And essentially, there's a great pithy box from Eldar Shafir of Ideas 42, who's a pretty brilliant man, who describes the psychology of scarcity and talks about when you are without, the impact of being without is not just the direct impact of what you don't have. It can be much greater than that. And specifically, they talk about sort of 3 impacts of living with scarcity. So tunneling, which means basically you're sort of in a tunnel vision. You're always in a short-term crisis management mode, which I think we can all agree is not optimal. The second consequence of the scarcity is borrowing, and more specifically, over-borrowing. Okay, so I'm desperate. I'm going to not really think about whether I can repay my loans. I'm going to borrow as much as I can to sort of deal with my crisis today. And then the third impact is, I want to make sure I use the right term, thank you, is distraction. And again, the idea that under stress, decision-making is really suboptimal, because I can't really actually focus on this, and really my intelligence actually sort of drops. And so the conclusion of that chapter is really that we, those of us who actually really want to work with and serve people who are living with scarcity, is that we need to figure out how to do the right things, I'm quoting now, how to do the right things to help diminish the stress of scarcity. And if we don't get that right, then in the particular area we work in, financial services, people are not going to be able to make good decisions today in terms of the financial choices they want to make, but also thinking about financial decisions through a life cycle perspective. So for me, that was really powerful, and I think the real implications for how we work, which is also we can't have tunnel vision in terms of financial service. Let me get them that service they don't have. It's a lot more complex. I'll just say, if I may, and this is also in the report, some work that CGAP is doing with Ford Foundation and many different implementing partners on the ground. I think we did have the full knowledge about the sort of psychology of scarcity, but we somehow stumbled across this in some of the work we're doing with the extreme poor. And 2 of the partners are highlighted in the report, Foncose in Haiti and Bandhan in India, where in work with the extreme poor, the very first thing that we do with people is we provide them consumption support. Again, the idea that if you're hungry, there's no way you're going to be able to plan for the future, make smart decisions. So consumption support, an asset transfer, you need to actually have an opportunity for a livelihood, and then we go into savings, actually, and other kinds of services. And my last point, I had another highlight, but I'm going to stay with just my first highlight, but I will round this up, which is to say that there's also some pretty rigorous work that's being done, including around this graduation program with the 2 examples in the report, Foncose and Bandhan, around trying to capture what Dean Carlin from IPA calls the happiness index. and it's actually sort of rigorous ways to try and capture how people feel about themselves, how they evaluate their own level of stress, whether they have a positive outlook to the future, whether they're even able to have a future orientation. And we actually have seen, there's a composite index that was created by the researchers, and we have seen improvement on that index for people. And The Economist even wrote an article about this, saying maybe that could be what really breaks the poverty trap. This sort of happiness or positive outlook, the future orientation is critical, and you can have that when you're not sort of really under the weight of the psychology of scarcity.
Alexia, thank you for those really excellent points. And Larry, I wonder if you would like to talk more about this whole issue of the psychology of scarcity, and why would you include that in a report about the microcredit summit?
Well, we do it in the report when we first looked at mobile technology as sort of the answer to this issue of, well, maybe the traditional microcredit loan has reached its peak in some parts of the world, and we need to look broader at how to get to more remote areas, how to get to poorer clients. Technology can drive costs down and allow us to reach those. And then we thought, well, but technology is only a means, it's a channel, but it's not a product. And how do you develop the products that are appropriate using that technology that actually meets the needs of poor clients? And so we started looking at this work on the psychology of scarcity to look more closely at what are the factors that they're dealing with? What are the challenges that poor clients are facing? Those living in severe poverty, what are the financial issues that they face, and what are the other issues that they face? What are their needs, their aspirations, and how do you develop products that fit with that? And so we wanted to look more at this issue of scarcity and how it affects how people think. And so that leads us back to something, David, you wrote in your book when you talked about credit being a prescription strength medicine. And I think this talk about the psychology of scarcity gets back to that point, that it is powerful, but it can be powerfully good or powerfully bad. And if we don't deliver it in the right way, what technology will do will speed up the efficiency and the quickness with which we deliver it, but it could be delivered poorly. And so the thinking behind this is we need to do a lot more. What the sort of work Alexia is doing now in putting the client at the center, what you're doing with your financial inclusion work, Susy, what USAID is trying to do in your work is to look closely at what is happening to the client and how do we develop products that actually help them improve their lives, get to a better place, help them get out of this sort of trap, out of this the psychology of scarcity to more of a psychology of abundance.
Let's return to that whole big headline, which is numbers went down, which is certainly not something that we were expecting to see. And Wendy, I'd like to ask you about your experience at USAID. You have an overview of a lot of what's going on from the donor perspective. Are you finding that same trend occurring among the partners at USAID?
We are finding some of the same general trends, but the fact is our data and the fact that the number of clients is going down is really a reflection of our programming rather than any unique data set that actually talks about the larger world out there. So, but still in all, it's pretty dramatic. From 2008 to 2011, our spending went up in that sector, 259 million to 286 million. But the number of clients went down from 4.7 to 1.4 million borrowers. And from 2.8 to 2 million savers and 1.5 to 1.2 microenterprise owners and employees. So those numbers are pretty dramatic shifts.
Did you say 4.7 $7 million, did I get
To
this right?
1.4
To 1.4 million. Man,
Right,
and you spent more money to do that.
yes.
Wow.
And it wasn't because those 1.4 got more on an individual basis that we decided to just give the big guys more money. No. What's happened is we basically reduced the amount of support that we're giving to microfinance institutions and have moved that money into things that are very much very sympathetic to the kinds of conclusions that this report comes to. So we, for example, we had an evidence summit pretty recently, and there we were talking about pathways out of poverty and inclusive growth and a lot of focus on risk management and vulnerability. What that's led to programmatically is an enormous amount of work on value chains, which is kind of interesting and potentially problematic in the sense that something I'd like us to talk about is we knew what we were doing when we were trying to build an industry. Now we're talking about markets and the relationship between a project that we might run and how that is going to spread to lift more people out of poverty is not so clear. It does mean that in one sense we're all drinking the same Kool-Aid because if you look at USAID, there's this shift in this office's programming over time. That's combined with a big increase in one of the presidential initiatives on Feed the Future, which focuses on the poorest of the poor in agriculture, largely on women, does not go to the parts of the country that are already the breadbasket, but actually goes to more remote areas, focuses on nutrition, and is all about value chains. I mean, I don't think I've got a percentage of that, close to $1 billion that's spent on it. But so now we've got a lot riding down on this. Plus, most recently, you probably saw or heard about this strategy. I wanted to make sure, Rachel, maybe you know whether it's a strategy or a policy or on resilience. But there again, same theme. Same theme, which is how do people manage risk, the most vulnerable, what are the things that we need to do. So a lot, I would say, because we don't do a good job of tracking type of programming over time, I can't document this very well, but a lot more money going into this space, generally what we're talking about, but a lot less institution building.
David, you've looked quite a bit at the importance of institution building in some of your work. I just wonder if you have a comment about that different strategy just based on your own observations.
I don't know if I have a lot of wisdom to offer, but I agree that it was, not to suggest that it was easy to go about building microfinance institutions, but that's something that feels easier to me, because it's more focused, and something that people have figured out how to do, than building value chains. I think there is something to be said for doing one thing that you have reasonable confidence is going to be good for development, with knock-on effects that you won't completely analyze or control, because it's enriching the financial system, ideally by providing poor people with a variety of financial services, not just credit, and not worrying about the rest. And there's a danger of becoming overly ambitious. There's a counter-argument, which is provided by the model of BRAC, which has always been an extraordinarily ambitious organization in Bangladesh. They're the ones that inspired the graduation programs that we're talking about, but which involves bringing a package of services to people, not just financial services. But they've also been ambitious in other dimensions. They say, well, we're going to develop a business that we think is appropriate for certain poor people, like raising chickens for egg-laying hens. And we won't just help them do that, but we'll build the entire industrial infrastructure, right, and the marketing and so on. And they seem to have done a good job with some of that, by trial and error. And so maybe the lesson here is that you can get more ambitious, but it has to be an experimental approach with practice modeling.
You're mentioning that brings to mind a comment that you had made earlier about one of the points in the report is looking not just at vulnerability of the clients, and I assume when you labeled this effort vulnerability, you were thinking a lot about the vulnerability of the clients, but also the vulnerability of the institutions. I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that piece.
What I think is most striking about this report, and by the way, I really did enjoy it. Just a nice, sort of open-minded sampling of voices.
Worth $7.95.
I'm cheap. What can I say? It's all free, right? So,
right. If you want paper, you got to pay for the paper.
Of course, Larry's signature and the signature of the other people, that's worth a lot. But there's of course, if you wanted to get the most attention you possibly could for this, you would have put that graph showing the decline in the last year on the cover, right? And I don't know if there's a press release, but that would have been dramatic findings. For the first time ever since you've been tracking this, the numbers went down. And you have de-emphasized that, which I think it's interesting, and I don't mean that in a euphemistic sense. So there's a very clear theme which is about vulnerability, which seems a little bit different. It seems like it's over here and the numbers are over here. But of course they are integrated, and they're integrated through your the block, the box, which quotes from I think an interview with Digidas in India, who talks about how microfinance institutions are as vulnerable as their clients. Right. And so that's the lesson of India, is that clients are vulnerable, and therefore the institutions were vulnerable, more vulnerable than they realized. And I think that that's a really nice formulation. But I do think it's also interesting to think critically about it, because one of the charges against microfinance, because there are a lot of critics out there now, is that actually it's quite sustainable and it's sustainably exploiting people. So that the institutions are actually much more robust than the clients. That's the accusation. And so the exhibit A would probably be comportamos, right? It's charging 100% interest or whatever year after year, making great profits off of clients who are much more vulnerable than it is. So I do think that actually, I don't think that comportamos is the devil incarnate, but I do think that the example of comportamos illustrates that we cannot assume that vulnerability of clients equates to vulnerability of institutions, and therefore that any institution that lasts is not in some way exploiting or burdening clients. I still think that there's a burden on microfinance institutions to look at the impacts of their services on clients, even when they're doing okay.
Let's go back to talking about these numbers. You're talking about this downward trend, and that is a big story. And there's also a story about. Well, David, I'm going to kick this one back to you again, because you've done a lot of thinking about numbers, and tell us more about what you think about these numbers and how they play out with this.
Yeah. Years ago I wrote about third world debt, and there was this very effective international campaign called Jubilee 2000 for canceling the debt of a lot of the poorest countries. And one of the things that the campaign said was essentially that the debts as they then existed were killing 19,000 children every day, because they were depriving governments of money that they needed to spend on vaccination and what have you. And I looked into this number, and it was total nonsense. And so then I asked myself, who's the naive one here, right? On the one hand, I think that they're being very simplistic about the truth, and that seems naive to me. On the other hand, this is a really effective campaign, and it's actually done some good in the world, because a lot of these debts, the debts of these third world nations did need to be reduced, and it probably wouldn't have been if it hadn't been for this campaign, using these powerful but simple messages. And I have seen some of that in microfinance, and so I'm vaguely uncomfortable with the thrust of Microcredit Summit campaign over the years, focusing on these numbers and these targets, because even though I think the people inside the campaign know that the world is a complex place. It generates this simple message that goes out to the public, which is more is always better. The revised goals, I think, they were adopted, is it Halifax?
Right.
There's actually, I hadn't fully appreciated it. There are two different goals. One goal is the number of clients served, which is by 2015, I don't know what it is, 150 million? 175 million. The second one is about lifting people above poverty. 100 million people will climb out of extreme poverty.
Right.
The first of those is really easy to measure, but as we've learned lately, is ambiguous in its meaning. Maybe more is not always better. The second one is really important. No one can argue with that, lifting people out of poverty, but really hard to measure. If I could give you a list of 100 million people who have climbed out of poverty, there might be 200 more who have fallen into poverty. And aside from that, we still don't know what's causing what. Maybe they climbed out of poverty because their economies are growing, not because of microfinance. So there is this danger when we pursue these big numbers and put them out there that we will mislead the public about how important they are, or how certain we can be that they're being achieved, how meaningful they are. Actually figuring out what the impact of microfinance is very hard, but we do have more and more good studies. So I'm kind of arguing myself now. I do see the value. There's a chapter that I didn't write for my book, which is about the history of the microfinance movement, in which the Microcredit Summit Campaign and Sam Daly-Harris are absolutely central. And without them, I don't think the movement would be where it is today, and we wouldn't have so many people receiving what I think are often, most of the time, useful services. So this kind of simplistic message has, I think, done good, but it also has some costs that we're now struggling with, I think.
So Larry, I think you need to respond. This is, one of the things that David's talking about is just, the whole existence of targets or goals.
Right. Just to pile in.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is actually a big debate at USAID. Our administrator has fought long and hard for quantitative targets, and they are of the second sort. They are the ones that are the hard to measure ones. The targets are not about how many widgets or books were delivered. They are about the outcome measures. Some of the arguments, people don't like it because it makes us accountable, which is which seems self-serving, but actually isn't self-serving if you think that you fail and all of a sudden the country decides that they don't want to do any more development. So it has some real risks to it. I actually happen to be a big fan of them because I think they have the potential of actually spurring the careful work, because which you can do a good job at setting the goal, and then you can fail at the second test. Because obviously, if you were taking the goal of 100 million out of poverty seriously, you'd actually have to get on the job of measuring it. You'd have to decide, is it a net number? It would be a mountain of work, but probably a mountain of really good work that would drive everybody into, did my program help? Was I, how many kids did I lift? So, anyway.
Okay, I know I said I was going to let you respond. However,
Changed your mind.
I did, because
I'll pile on.
Exactly. Because Alexia, I know you've been involved in this whole issue of data measurement and collection. And so I think that's a natural follow-on to Wendy's point. And then we're going to give Larry time to really come up with a good response while we talk about that issue.
Okay, so I'm not as media savvy as David, so I will say I'm glad you didn't put the graph on the cover of the report. Because although it's something critical, we have to understand those numbers, actually for me the headline was not those numbers. Because of some of the issues that we were, I think, arguing with yourself about. Which is, I think, the goal is in front of us all. So, access is important, but that's the beginning of the conversation. Access to what service, and I would argue looking beyond credit is critical. argued to what quality of service, critical, and I think standards to understand quality indicators were nowhere near there. Understanding the dynamics of usage, so access is one thing, but how an individual actually uses a service, when they make the decision of what service to use for what purpose to solve what problem in their lives, what frequency they use the service, what is the optimal level of usage is a big deal with credit. I would argue even with savings in a high inflationary environment, if it's savings or eating, which we've heard too, of people saying, you know what, I'm used to being hungry, I'll continue being hungry, but I want to save to build that roof for when the rainy season comes. These are complicated choices. So I want to congratulate the summit, and I think being, as you were saying, David, an early forewarner of really putting emphasis on the importance of data collection and analysis. I think today we're in a world that has to be more precise and more nuanced, where we can't be measuring access in a brute fashion. We need to be measuring usage and of a range of financial services, and we need to develop standards for quality indicators. I think the good news is there's a lot of exciting work complementing what the summit has been doing, both on the demand side with the global Findex indicators, on the supply side, the IMF has a financial access survey, and the G20 has put data as one of their top priorities for working financial inclusion. They've created a basic set of financial inclusion indicators that are pretty basic, so partly some of the numbers that you look at, but they're now working on a second generation of indicators with a mandate to get to quality indicators. And they're doing all of this not sitting in European capitals, but it's really bottom up, working with countries like Brazil, countries like Mexico, that really are trying to find useful, meaningful indicators to track their progress in financial inclusion.
Great. So now, Larry.
Okay. So, David, you had the history right, that the Microcredit Summit campaign, when Sam Daly-Harris started it with John Hatch and Mohammed Yunus, the idea was to get to 100 million, and the assumption was more was better, and that more clients led to more people moving out of poverty. When they came to Halifax in 2006, the decision was made, if they got from 8 million, where they started, to 100 million was a pretty big jump. There was some push to 200 million, 250 million, 300 million that they should go for over the next period of time. And they consciously chose to dial back and to say, no, let's not go for just growth, let's go for quality. And so the second goal came in, which was measuring movement out of poverty. Problem was, how do you measure movement out of poverty, as you said exactly. And the challenge I have coming in now to this job is there's no baseline from 2006 that I can measure from to see how far we've gone. And what we're doing now is a change in priority on the goals from the first goal to the second goal. And to prioritize that one and encourage the use of measures that are out there. So there are Food Security Survey, there's Progress Out of Poverty Index, there's the Poverty Assessment Tool. There are many tools out there that are pretty good at measuring what happens. Don't give you causality. Sure, that's a problem. But what I find, one of the fun parts of my job now is going out and meeting with these organizations that actually do this work, that actually measure movement out of poverty or movement away from poverty over time by clients. And what I find when I meet with those organizations, and there's some of the ones that we highlight in this study, Bandhan, Foncose, CARD, Equitas, they all figure out that, well, access to financial services helps in these areas, but there are other challenges our clients face that if they can't deal with those challenges, then financial services aren't going to help them anymore. And so they figure out ways to deliver those other services through the same channels they've delivered the financial services, but in a way that helps their clients overcome those obstacles as well. And I think what we've seen now with the randomized control trials that have been done is we sort of have two extremes on a continuum. So we have one extreme which is looking at credit credit given for whatever purpose a client wants to use it for. And that the studies show that there are some positive effects of that, but that there's no statistically significant change in poverty levels of that versus a control group. And then you have the graduation model work that shows significant movement, but highly subsidized type of programs that start with subsidies for people with consumption. And somewhere in the middle are these other types of programs, like what Equitas runs, where they do grocery stores for clients, and they do training for clients' children, and they set up health centers and do health fairs and things like that. And so the question I think we're going to need to research now is how close to sustainability can you get with what types of clientele, and what mixes of models can you work with that actually will lead to movement away from poverty. I think ultimately, I wrote a blog on this after Martin Luther King Day, that this is something we have to continue to measure ourselves against this poverty yardstick. As difficult as it is, just as you said, Wendy, that it pushes us into the harder problems. What's connected to the poverty our clients face? What are the other issues that we have to deal with here? Ultimately, when I think about causality, I think the only causal instrument in this is the client themselves, that they're the ones that amass the different tools that they need to pull themselves out of poverty, and that they're going to pull from whatever sources they have. And our job is to try to find the right mix of tools to make them available so that clients can use them in ways that make their lives better.
I think, Alexia, you had a question you were looking at for Larry that's a good follow-on to that point about that ecosystem. And I wonder if we might have that be our last question for Larry before we open up and take questions and comments from the group here.
So I do, but if I just can't resist a quick follow-up to what you just said, because I think the ecosystem of services to get people out of poverty, I think, is what we need to be looking at, not just the ecosystem of providers of services. And I think there's been a long debate in the microfinance field of, finance only, or do you get into non-financial services, and the two camps don't talk to each other. But I actually think that this year's summit, the theme is actually, I think, partnerships, finance, and business and governments. And my aspiration for your summit, if I may, is that the conversation is not just in the microfinance, do we have financial services or not, but is 10 times more profound about maybe we, who love financial services, need to fully understand our role and understand how to speak to people who are completely different from us, the social protection folks, the livelihood folks, and create true partnerships across disciplines. Not just we from the BROC, not every institution can be a BROC. And I think we've learned from the graduation work, which was inspired by BROC. In some cases, there's one institution doing the range of things like BROC, but in most cases, you have a government partner, you have a healthcare provider, you really do have a complicated set of institutions that come from very different disciplines, different vocabularies, and so setting up the partnerships are not fun. It's hard work. But I think if you can really attack that in a profound way, it's much more powerful than microfinance with non-financial services or not. It's just, anyway. So, and then my question to you, I think, is, again, on this data point and looking forward, I mean, the landscape has evolved so much in terms of the types of institutions that now work with poor, including extremely poor people. And I want to understand the summit's plan to actually, broaden the base of folks that you actually collect data from, so that we really start to have a more and more comprehensive picture of access. So, are you looking at the mobile network operators, and of course, it's the challenge of product and delivery channels.
Right. So yeah, that is a challenge, and it's one of the things we're actually in discussions with the mix on this now, so that we could partner with them on doing data collection, and we have access to certain groups that report to us and don't report to them. They have access to other groups, and try to get one source that collects as much data as possible in the industry, and then we would focus more then on analyzing the data from the perspective of the bottom end and looking at commitments that organizations make and sort of challenges they give to themselves about helping people move out of poverty. But I think when you look at this ecosystem, I think the reason we chose this theme for our summit in the Philippines in October on partnerships is that these different groups need to work together, that there are many different constraints that poor people face, and if we can provide these services in a way that poor people have access to them in a reasonable way when they need them, it can help them move ahead and help them deal with the vulnerabilities. Question of people moving back into poverty, is it a net number, is a big question. We did a study in Bangladesh that found lots of people moving out of poverty but moving back in as well, so the net was a smaller number. So the challenge for us is to be able to track movement of people. I think if we use that as our target, what is happening in terms of levels of poverty? And this is my challenge to the financial inclusion groups. The different levels in which that happens is ultimately the goal of this has to be people at the bottom end living better lives. And we need to have some measure of that we can agree on to measure the quality of our performance. Otherwise, we can have people doing a lot more financial transactions that lead to them becoming worse off. And we can repeat the same mistakes just on a larger scale with better technology. And so that was why in this report we wanted to look at what do elements of quality look like? And how do we understand what's going on in clients' lives? How do we measure real progress in a way that tells us whether or not their lives are improving?
I just wanted to jump in on that. When you say things like how are we going to measure the improvement in the quality of people's lives, it's kind of a touchstone to how difficult the task is, right? And so this report sort of admonishes us to think very carefully about people, to have lots of flexibility. All of that adds up to a very expensive set of products and services. And one of my, and very hopeful and very, I mean, we're urged to do this and why that's important to do. Microfinance actually had a business model that actually worked. There isn't a model out there for how this is going to, this set of services, if we're all in agreement, research seems to show that it works, if you can, that you have some successes. So we're on to something, but not a lot of thinking done about the kind of the scale-up possibilities. So that maybe, for example, the client and the audience needs to be governments. So we are entirely doing our work to sort out within a country how those things are going to get delivered to people. Or what BRAC brings to mind in my mind is, well, who could be a BRAC? Well, Cargill. I mean, it's literally a huge company that is going to be delivering services and supplies. It's going to do the company store. It's going to do, it is, that's much more, and those guys are actually, some of those guys, not that particular guy, I don't know, is actually thinking about doing that. The little tiny businesses, you know, the ecosystems, I mean, there's something about the word ecosystem that screams problem to me, because, you know, an ecosystem is not something you go buy a share in, or I get, you know, it's like just, it's just code for complicated and difficult. And I've been spending, and the agency's been spending some time on the impact investors, who you would think would be available, but that wall of cash that we've been expecting from impact investing to arrive for those fragile businesses that need to wend their way around an echo, that wall of cash has not arrived. So it has its own sort of issues. So I think that's the big issue for me is how are we going to scale this if we now know what it's needed?
Sure. Katie.
One thought on some of what's been said here and in the report. As I see it, the report talks about two kinds of developments in the microfinance movement and really beyond it. One is mobile money, mobile technology. There's some stuff on that, and the other is what we've been talking about: these graduation programs that bring a package of services, and for which there are now some randomized trials suggesting positive impact. And there's a sort of a sense that I get from the report that the graduation programs, those are the true heirs of microcredit. that's where we should try to go, figure out how to make that sustainable. And I'm unnecessarily dichotomizing things here, but I want to argue against that idea and argue that mobile money actually is the true heir to microcredit. First of all, I'm not sure that the studies have demonstrated the impact of a set of services. I don't know if they have separated out the microfinance. Maybe the services would have just as much impact without the financial side.
Savings.
Okay, but if you take that just as savings. I don't know the studies that well, and I should. But so the report says, for example, that digital technology has provided more promises than results. It sort of is emphasizing the negative and the disappointment here. But I see what's happened with mobile money as a huge success, even if, as shown in the report, people are using it primarily to transfer money, not to save. Because that's a great service. People are using that in all sorts of ways that weren't imagined, literally to avoid highway robbery, to engage in lower cost domestic trade. Lots of ways that M-Pesa in Kenya and other systems like it have been successful and on a very large scale. And to me, the fact that they're operating in a business-like way and providing a service that's clearly useful to poor people, that's closer, in my mind, to the vision that I think Muhammad Yunus had than these graduation programs, as good as they are, which are not clearly sustainable as a business model.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I think the dichotomy, I think it's a completely false dichotomy. Completely false dichotomy. Mobile, for me, the power of the mobile chapter in the report is a reminder that the economics matter when it comes to reaching the poorest. It's expensive, and if we don't innovate to figure out how to reach them, certainly away from credit, we're not going to get there, because credit may pay for itself, but savings and the other products that we care about will not. So we need to be creative, and mobile is an exciting innovation. But it's not in itself anything in terms of financial services. You're building things onto it. And so mobile, by the way, could be integrated into a graduation program for the savings component of the packages delivered to the extreme poor. So there's no dichotomy. I completely agree, scaling up graduation governments. It has to be governments. And a lot of money is today spent on social protection programs where people have to spend the money, governments are spending the money year and year and year again, because there is no promotion strategy in those programs. It's just protecting people, which is important, but there's no plan for the future. And so the governments are spending the same money over and over. The premise of graduation is if we invest more up front, maybe some of these people will actually graduate out of extreme poverty and will no longer be needing cash transfers in perpetuity.
I will argue that that it's everyone. Certainly the governments and providers and mobile network operators, the microfinance institutions on the ground. It's everybody taking a piece. But what I appreciate about the Microcredit Summit Campaign's vision and this report is that there's a continual calling back to the original vision. What is the purpose behind it all? And that is a very hard thing to grasp. Wendy, you were talking about this. It is hard. And so I appreciate that you're focusing on the hard part. We have some illustrious people in this audience, and I wonder if there are some questions or comments from the audience as well. Although if there aren't, you can see we could keep an argument going perfectly well on our own. Dan Durrell of World Vision.
Oh, there are people. This is a question for Wendy, but others feel free to join in. And that is, I think, kind of following on the questions around the graduation approach. If we think about the poorest 5 to 8% of a population, and we think about the Evidence Summit, and I was able to watch on microlinks.org with Hashmi, his presentation on the graduation approach at the Evidence Summit in December. The asset transfer is certainly part of that, but also in that model, there's actually a caseworker who works with those families, and with Fonklase, working with the extremely poorest families. But there's also the MFI connection in both the BROC model, but also the CGAP and Ford Foundation replications. So as you've had the Evidence Summit, you've read the report, what's your thinking in terms of what you would recommend, certainly within your own Bureau of E3, but also with the Bureau of Food Security, with the Feed the Future initiative, but also with the Title II programming? How do we work, certainly with governments, also with the private sector, both for-profit and not-for-profit, to help those poorest 5 to 8% work their way slowly up out of extreme poverty? Is that clear in terms of my question?
The agency is kind of launched in some sense in that Feed the Future, which has been doing a lot of this programming, is doing very definitive things. There's a country strategy in each country. There's a set of people receiving services. There are a set of crops that they are focused on, value chains picked out. And I think is very much in this general spirit. We've got to run that programming to ground. We have to evaluate it. We have to understand it. We have to see whether that set of hypotheses are going to work, because they're ambitious. They're much more concentrated than historically our programming has been. I think that's a major priority. In E3, what we see our role more and more is doing the pilots and the experiments, the things that are not ready for prime time that you wouldn't want to do a big program, and trying to do that in through the grand challenges and a lot of other things in a more collaborative way, where we're admitting up front that we don't actually have the answer. World Vision is very much involved in one of those grand challenges in education with us. So I think that's the general road that we're going down. I think as an agency we are more aligned and working harder at aligning with other agencies so that these things build on each other than we ever have before. I guess the final thing, which I know I'm not supposed to do, is to continue an earlier argument. Which is to say, I of course, I agree with Alexia, but I really wish that there were a dichotomy, and I really wish that David were right. Because if the mobile phone, whose economics do kind of work, it would definitely be one we'd want to pile on. And there's one dimension of the mobile phone thing that I think is worth keeping in mind. And Tavneet Suri and some other people have written about this. The real action is not going to be is going to be in the business-to-business solutions. So when we talk about these eco-enterprises and these ecosystems that we all want, that really means businesses. And businesses whose economics are changed by this very low-cost methodology. So I think we have to have our kind of bases covered. We have to anticipate all the hard work and complexity that Alexia is sending us on to, but cross our fingers that this other could deliver big time.
And I want to say, Wendy, also that as somebody who's observed USAID at times very closely, at times not as closely over the years.
Thank you.
One of the things that many of us had pushed for a number of years was for USAID to be more risk-taking and innovative, and to support some of these pilots that maybe wouldn't be the sweet success stories to tell Congress. And so I'm really glad to see that you are trying some new things, and that's a really good thing. Were there other questions Alice, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us where you're from?
Thanks very much. My name's Alice. I work for Care International, but in the UK, but I happen to be in the US this week, so I was very pleased to be able to come to your discussion. As many of you will know, Care spent many, many years facilitating village savings and loans groups across the world, and I think we facilitate something like 3 million or so at the moment. And we are finding increasingly that many private sector actors want to work with us now to try and link some of these informal groups to more formal financial service providers so they can then access credit, overdraft, savings facilities. I thought it was very interesting in your report, there's one line in there that mentions that whilst the sort of general finding is that there are fewer people wanting to access loans, there are actually increasing numbers interested in looking at the savings-led approaches, and I wondered if you could give us a bit more information about why you think that might be.
And just building on what Alice says, this was kind of interesting to me that you did not highlight this, Larry, because on page 9, it says the number of poorest clients served slowed in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So you talked about that. Rebounded from slow growth in 2010 in the Middle East and North Africa, and accelerated in Sub-Saharan Africa. We didn't talk about that part, and that's the savings groups.
Right. So
if you add those numbers to the increase in transfer payments, you actually, across products, you may have a very different picture than you just have on credit, which is, I think, what you were maybe saying.
right. There was an increase in Africa, which I did say, but it was not as much as the decrease in India. But it was largely from the savings groups that went on, and we count savings groups. We get an estimate from them of how many of those who are saving in the savings groups are also borrowing. So that's how we get this number here.
But those are borrowers in the savings.
Borrowers in the savings groups. Yep. But let me look at this more holistically. If we're talking about vulnerability, then we're talking about a family's ability to withstand shocks, whether it's healthcare or crop failure or illness, but also to take advantage of opportunities. And so savings is an essential part of that. For a family to really have the ability to withstand these things and to take advantage of opportunities, they need to be able to put money aside, and put money aside in a way that's safe and easily accessible. And so savings has to be a key part of any strategy for reducing vulnerability. Savings in a place that retains its value over time, that can be accessed, that doesn't get stolen. And that's why savings groups, I think, have taken off so well. It provides a way for people to store their money in a safe setting with other group members, and it gives them access to a loan when they have an opportunity that would pay a good rate of return. So I think that's what the popularity of these are. And I think I'd like to see more experiments about how they link up to the financial system, but I think, let's not rush it. Let's let them evolve and try some experiments and see what works out there.
And I know there's a report that just came out, was it last week, Banking on Change, and that might be another interesting read. And speaking of interesting reads, I don't have my copy right here, but Dan Norell, what was the title of your publication that came out recently?
It's called Integrating Very Poor Producers into Value Chains Field Guide, and it's also on microlinks.org.
And that's good comment based on what Wendy was talking about, the difficulties of expanding to different value chain approaches and looking at whole market issues. I wanted to point those two out because it's part of that whole question of how are we all part of something bigger, and how are each of us taking a piece of the puzzle and moving it forward. I get to do my quick plug for my project, which is the Financial Inclusion 2020 campaign. It was just launched last week, and we have a brand new website and an interactive Mapping the Invisible Market data set. You can go on and look at country-specific data sets, pull your own indicators that you're interested in experimenting with, and do your own analysis of where financial inclusion is compared to demographics and some other important data sets. So we encourage you to go look at financialinclusion2020.org. I think we have plenty of good arguments left in the room that we can continue after the mics are off. I do want to say thank you to Larry and to the team at the Microcredit Summit campaign. For one thing, for presenting us with a very readable report. Yes, it's really very well done. I've known Larry for years, and I've known the quality of his writing, and I appreciate that you not only have interesting observations and a lot of data to report, but that you present that to us in a very accessible way. And I loved how you brought in some stories from some other observers. It was interesting that several of us commented, particularly on some of the boxes with these stories that were brought in.
Right. That's the fun of doing this report, and that's why this year we tried to, on the website, make those available to you so you can see the interviews themselves and see what the people said and take your own highlights out of them. So we don't want to have all the fun to ourselves here.
So thank you for this $7.95 report.
And Camille Rivera and Sabina Rogers, if you could stand up there, the two that are responsible for this report. So excellent job.
So this wraps up this session, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Larry and Sabina, Camille, everybody at the Microcredit Summit. And Sabina, you have a closing remark for us? And before I turn it over to you, I do want to thank our panelists, Wendy Abt, David Roodman, and Alexia Latortue for